Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Rotary Club of Edina. I'm Sam Thompson and I'm proud to be your 66th president. We're coming to you live from the Edina Country Club and also on Zoom. We had 42 people pre-register live and 38 pre-registered on Zoom. Through the struggles our world has had, we've experienced this past year, our club has had many accomplishments. A major accomplishment has been our Race and Equity Committee, which is co-chaired by Sylvester Thomas and Jennifer Benerod. As this is our first meeting in February is Black History Month, I thought it was appropriate to share with you an update on our Race and Equity Committee. Our Race and Equity Committee's goals are to increase diversity in our membership, bring awareness of race and equity issues in Edina and the area, develop leaders of color, and support organizations that assist people of color. Our Race and Equity Committee is also working with Don Hutchinson, our speakers chair, providing educational speakers that will address diversity, such as today's speaker, Dr. Campbell. Rotary International adopted a statement on diversity, equity, and inclusion in January of 2019. It states, as a global network that strives to build a world where people unite and take action to create lasting change, Rotary values diversity and celebrates the contributions of people of all backgrounds, regardless of their age, ethnicity, race, color, abilities, religion, socioeconomic status, culture, sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. By starting a Race and Equity Committee, our club is not making a political statement. We are making a people statement. Rotary International President Holger Knack said, "In Rotary, we stand for values of equity, tolerance, and peace." Tolerance is a relevant concern in so many parts of the world now. Rotary is not political and it must stay that way. But when things obviously go wrong, we cannot look away. Rotarians must not be speechless. We stand by our values and our four-way test. We're measured not only by our results, but also by our attitude. In the wake of George Floyd's death, the Rotary International Board of Directors decided Rotary needed to do more. A diversity, equity, and inclusion task force was formed, bringing together experts from around the world to develop an international approach. The task force is devising a plan that assesses the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Rotary and articulates a vision that incorporates regional differences, needs, and priorities. Our club has taken action. Financially, we supported the George Floyd Memorial Rotary Scholarship this past August that was created by our district and 6 other clubs that were in the district. It's a 4-year scholarship to the University of Minnesota for a first-generation African-American college student. Our local grants committee has reached out to many organizations that assist people of color to determine their needs. Our foundation board will begin to approve our local grant request later this month. And our Race and Equity Committee started a book club that's part of our educational efforts. The first book is White Fragility: Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism. I'm happy to announce we've already had 25 books that have been ordered. Regarding race and equity, we have had an open and honest dialogue that has already been created in our membership. All of us in leadership welcome and encourage your thoughts and ideas regarding our Race and Equity Initiative. And we can always use more people on the committee. I'm proud to see how much our Race and Equity Committee has accomplished in such a short period of time, yet there still is much more to do. Our club's efforts are holding true to Rotary's value of equality, tolerance, and peace. Now, for member update. Bob Hildreth, and his wife Ann have been sheltering in place beginning of the pandemic. And at first they were working from home, and then they went to their cabin in Wisconsin. And recently they took a trip to Florida to relax, and so that Bob could check on his mother. And here's a good shot of Bob catching a big fish. And Paul Mooty was just recently, I know Paul's here today, recently his company, Faribault Woolen Mills, had a nice story, a 3-minute story on his firm on WCCO News last night about how well his company's doing through the pandemic. And hopefully, if we have time next week, I'd like to show that video. And Rotary in the news, our Rotaract Club, which is actually, Rotaract is our farm team. We have so many different types of clubs. So it's our young professionals, 18 to 30 years old, and they had a skating get-together at Centennial Lakes last Saturday. So here they are, looks like they're having a great time. And birthdays. This next week we have 4 birthdays, so happy birthday everybody. And anniversaries. We have 4 anniversaries this next week too, so congratulations. Whoops. And assisting off the podium, our greeter is, I don't think Mike Hagan was here today. He's listed, I think it was Fred was helping. Zoom greeter is Catherine Gump. Front desk, Dan Hulberg. Photographer Rick Carlson, working the room. And AV support is Ryan Wilson. And one last announcement, please make sure to put your masks back on after you eat for your safety and the safety of our other members. And now I'd like to call up Sutton McGraw for the invocation, pledge, and the 4-way test.
Dear Heavenly Father, let us bow our heads and pray silently together, as each of us do so according to our own beliefs. Thank you for the gift of Rotary, each other, and the opportunity to serve a greater need. Help us to provide the spirit of peace to heal the wounds of hatred, comfort those in sorrow, and those living in areas of unrest. We ask you to be with each and every one of us as we move about our daily lives, always keeping in mind the special talents we each possess. Let us be fair and kind to those in our path today. Let us focus on the objects of Rotary and implement those standards with your help. I'm grateful for all of you here that are present today and those who join us via Zoom. Have a wonderful rest of your week. In Jesus' precious name, amen. Amen. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And our 4-way test, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Hello everyone. It's so good to be here in person and see all your bright, shiny faces. I'm so glad to be here today. We have a few guests visiting with us today. Catherine Gump has 2 virtual guests joining us, Lloyd Campbell and Karen Rath. Catherine Gump and Jody Kern have a guest, Andrew Ramirez, today with us. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Jody. You're correct. And I believe, Andrew, I heard you say you're with the Uptown Rotary?
Yeah, I'm from Minneapolis Uptown Rotary, and I'm also working on the district planning committee for the Spring District Conference and tree planting project.
Awesome.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Josh Sprague has a couple of guests today.
Yes, I have Lutz Kaplan, who he and his family own a boutique at 50th and France called Cochinella. And I have Tim Zach, who is a lawyer here and lives in Edina, and his daughter Sophie Zach will be part of the first graduating class of the Rotary Global Scholars.
Thank you. Welcome to our guests.
Hi everyone, I am excited to talk about a partnership that our club is doing with the city of Edina. The mayor has challenged us to 2021 acts of kindness for this year. And so we have an online website. The city has bettertogetheredina.org/kindness challenge. And the idea is to do kind acts around the city, either submitting your own kind acts that you've done for someone else, or if someone does something kind for you, if someone shovels your walkway or clears your windshield or buys you a coffee, making sure that you're submitting them, because we're partnering to also support our local Edina restaurants. So each month, on the 15th of the month, will be a drawing. So all of the names for that month will go into a drawing for a $50 gift card to an Edina restaurant. So join me and other Rotarians as we do 2021 Acts of Kindness this year.
Hello, everyone. I am the current and acting treasurer and wanted to talk to you about ACH. ACH, it's a great way to pay your bills. So you just fill out a form with Becky, and it would be an automatic transfer from the bank to your bank to the pay your dues. About 40% of you are currently on the ACH, and it's worked out really well. And I would highly encourage you to sign up. Also, we're looking for more people to join us on the picnic committee, the funnest committee out of anyone for all of Rotary. So hopefully you can meet with Susan Johnson, and she'll be able to get you signed up, and we'll figure out how to do this picnic this year. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see everybody in person versus the little square shots of Zoom. I am here to talk about RARE. Well, never mind. What RARE stands for is Rotary Assisting Rotarians in Edina. This organization or subcommittee of membership was formed back in the early 90s by Gene Morrison and Bob Solheim for the purpose of notifying members of kind of bad things that were happening with members' deaths within families. This is before emails, so it would be a phone, like 10 people would call 5 or 10 people to let them know what was happening. And that has evolved. Right now, the good news is we send not only bad news, but we try to do happy news. For example, Bridget Hallstrom had a baby, so we did that announcement. Matt Bookmeyer, God only knows, if Alicia knows what she's getting into. Sorry, Matt, if you're on Zoom. But he is engaged, and we're thrilled that Matt is moving on and has found someone who can deal with him. But we also like to do other things. For example, if you know somebody who is having surgery, whether it be a hip replacement or a knee replacement, we'd like to know that because we'd like to be able to send them cards. We don't necessarily want to announce it to the whole club, but we would at least like to acknowledge those. So if you know of somebody who is having surgery or is going through some tough times, either Scott McDonald or myself, Tom Cook has opted to say that he will help us out, so you can give one of the three of us a call. On a sadder note, we have to announce about, all of you received the notice about Dwayne Schley, Sandy's husband, who passed away. The service is going to be tomorrow at 10:30, and that can be viewed virtually. So hopefully you can attend, participate in that. If you have any questions about RARE and what we do, please give Scott, Tom, or myself a call. That didn't mean you, Josh. Go ahead.
I'm having a second frontal lobotomy. Does that count?
No. Yeah, because the first one didn't work, so yeah. Thank you.
Only Josh would say that. Okay, one more announcement before we get into our program. Interact. Interact is our high school Rotary Club. And there are two individuals from Interact that are in the back, at the back table over there, by Becky. And they are having their Skate to End Polio event next Friday, the 12th. And they're selling tickets. There's $20 a ticket. It's at the Braemar Arena's backyard rink, and it would really help our club out and their club out if you would buy a ticket. You can also not only pay in the back there, but you can also go on Venmo at Interact Skate to End Polio. And you can also go to our website. That'll be up on our website too. Great. So now I am going to introduce Susan Stiles, who will be introducing our speaker today. Susan was raised in Ithaca, New York, with a lifetime interest in finance, hospitality, and entrepreneurship. Easy for me to say. Susan decided early on that she would pursue a career in business. She holds a bachelor's degree from the world-renowned School of Hotel Administration at Cornell University. Looking for a new challenge, Susan went back to school to get her MBA in Finance and Accounting from Cornell's Johnson Graduate School of Management. Shortly after graduating with her MBA, she moved to Minnesota and began building her financial services business one client at a time. In 2000, she started Stiles Financial Services, an independent portfolio management and advisory firm in Edina. Fluent in Spanish, Susan loves to travel, is an avid cook, entertainer, wine collector, and patron of the arts. Susan currently sits on her graduating class's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for Cornell University, where the committee is driving an initiative to foster, attract, and increase the Black student population at the university's hotel school. Susan lives in Edina with her husband Jeff and their 3 dogs, a couple of whom make frequent visits to the office. As I should know, I'm down the hall from Susan, and her dog barks at me all the time. She has 4 adult children who are all married and 2 grandchildren. Please welcome up Susan.
Thanks, Sam. Only Lucy barks at you. Giuseppe doesn't. Anyway, good afternoon, everybody, here at the club and on Zoom. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Paul Campbell, our speaker today. I met Paul through my husband, Jeff Robbins, and he runs an organization called Angel Pollination. It's a platform that brings together entrepreneurs with their cutting-edge ideas and angel investors. Paul presented to the group late last fall, and I had the chance to listen in, and I was really moved by what Paul had to say and what he shared about racial bias and that racial bias leads to about a $13 trillion loss in business revenue. I asked Jeff to introduce me to Paul, and we met virtually and had a very engaging conversation. And I really thought that my fellow Rotarians would love to hear what Paul has to say and to share. Jeff noticed that over the years of interacting with startup companies and entrepreneurs, he observed that there really is a complete void of representation from people of color, and in particular from the U.S. Black community in entrepreneurship. Jeff started asking that question around his contacts and his community, and then he had the fortune of meeting Paul, and that's how they came together. You know, it's really, the world is all about 1 degree of separation and networking. So Paul's going to give us a perspective today and an intellectual insight on how we're going to answer that question and what we need to do as a community to impact change. He'll share his personal experiences and insights, and as well as what sounds to me like a mission of his own personal growth and education, learning about this topic. Paul co-founded and is CEO of Brown Venture Group in St. Paul, Minnesota, right here. He launched it in 2018, and it's a venture capital firm that exclusively works for Black, Latino, and Native American technology startups. Paul is also a serial entrepreneur and holds a doctorate in social entrepreneurship from Minnesota Graduate School of Theology. When I heard that and read that, I thought, boy, that would be such an interesting field of study. He also has an MBA in global business management from Bethel University. He lives right here in St. Paul with his wife and 4 homeschool children. I don't know, that must keep you awfully busy, Paul, with little ones. So please join me with a warm welcome to Dr. Paul Campbell, to our Edina Rotary podium. Thank you.
Boy, she made me sound really good, didn't she? Well, I'm going to have to lean over a little bit because of the microphone, so I do apologize. But first, I want to start off by saying thank you so much for having me. I always start these conversations off with kind of set the expectation. I don't believe that I have all the answers, but I've wrestled with this topic of racial diversity myself. I've experienced it, and feel like all of us here have something to bring to the table in terms of our understanding of this and moving the conversation forward. So I say I don't have all the answers, but hopefully this conversation will be engaging for you and give you a lens and a framework to think about this issue differently. So, as Susan said a little bit about me, I'm a co-founder of Brown Venture Group. We started in 2018. And really, we started off the Brown Venture Group from a data point, and that is that 3% of venture capital actually goes into black and brown founders. Now, I wanted to know why this was. You know, I like to be data-informed and data-driven, but really this whole area of behavior science helped me with this lens of actually how to see this problem. And I'll start by saying this. Right now, if I tell you that I work with at-risk youth, what's the first image that comes to mind? What's the first face that you see? Exactly. The very language that we use to describe, as I call us, contributors of color, becomes deterministic. How far do you push somebody who's at risk to reach their full potential? It turns out not very far. Many people have viewed this lack of opportunity and stopped trying to solve the problem. And that's one of the biggest challenges we face today. The problem of racial inequity is so large, but people have a hard time cognitively solving the problem. And today we want to talk about how we can narrow those down to simplifying it. And it really starts off by creating friendships. Going back to this data point over here, 3% of venture capital goes into entrepreneurs of color. Does that mean that there's a lack of talent? No. What it actually shows is that there's actually a lack of relationship. Many contributors cannot think or recall to mind a person of color that owns a business, that has an investable company. And it's because someone made a decision a long time ago how easy it was for you and I, you know, being a white person and a brown person, to become friends. And that we call redlining. Redlining, we know the effects, how it's affected communities of color, but if you think about it, it also made it challenging for us to find investable companies and talent to hire for our companies, because we can't think of people in our sphere. If you pause for a moment and think, how many people of color do you know right now? Some of us, it's not very many, right? But is that whose fault is that really? People try to put a blame. It goes back to a lot of the historics that have occurred in our society, redlining, black codes, and others that have prevented relationship from forming. And as a result, all of us have paid for it. That's where the $13 trillion of business revenue has come to, is because we haven't had these opportunities to build relationships. We see from the data points there's also a tremendous upside. Black and brown founders have higher success rates, not because they're better in and of itself, it's because people oftentimes pick over the relationships they already know. So if you went to an Ivy League school, you kind of have that network. And if those people at the Ivy League school are all white, guess what? You're not going to go too far beyond your friends. Let's think about how we hire people at companies. It's all about, as sophisticated as we can get with our hiring practices, it always goes back to a relationship, right? This is why important relationship forming is so important. So the question really is here, what life-saving technologies or breakthrough innovations have we not seen as a result of cultural biases, right? There have been people who have been precluded from getting investments precisely because they've been viewed as highly risky. Well, if we see that $13 trillion of business revenue, and people, as I'm talking to folks, sometimes I'll hear people say, well, we have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders, right? To our constituents. What that translates to is I actually haven't done the thick thinking, the hard thinking to realize where is actually the opportunities, because if it's not a part of my circle, I have a hard time going outside of that. Now the challenge is how do we move beyond that? Is being more intentional. And these cognitive biases are all over the place. That's why I lead with the example of when I say I work with at-risk youth, what's the image that comes to mind? Here's an interesting thing too I want to talk about. Many folks, after the death of George Floyd, rushed out and obviously made commitments and said, we got to change this thing. We have to change what's been going on. But historically, what we've seen is people have been doing things for communities of color and not doing things with. When you do things for communities of color, it's a project. When you do things with communities of color, it's a partnership. And what we're saying in our communities, we don't need sympathy, we need opportunity. Opportunity is an event. Capacity is what you can do with that event. And the reality is that there's many people with high capacity that haven't been given the opportunity, which is an event. So at Brown Venture Group, we're trying to increase the events that contributors of color have to innovate and not only affect our community, but create economic and human flourishing for everybody. See, that's the thing. It's not about a black and white thing. It's about unleashing the full economic capability of everybody. I like the words we used when we first started here, contributors. Every single person here is a contributor. You may have a different hue, but you are a contributor, and we want to contribute to the vitality of our nation just like everyone else. And that's the shift in thinking that we really need to focus on. Let's move from doing things for communities of color versus doing things with communities of color, and you'll find better results. So Brown Venture Group, we started back in 2018. We started this idea of let's create an accelerator for communities of color. Let's be the Techstar or Y Combinator specifically for black and brown entrepreneurs. What we found is from our research, though, is that many contributors of color do not have friends and family rounds of investment. And if you're an investor, you want to see that somebody in the family has took a risk, right? The fool's round, the friends and family of fools. And if they haven't, that's an indication for you to say, you know what, they're probably not worth investing in. But the reality is, it's because of the economic policies that have been created that we haven't had that transferable wealth. If you have no transferable wealth, you can't get in a playing field. Brown Venture Group, we solve that problem, not only doing from series, seed all the way up, but we actually have our friends and family rounds of investment, meaning we're going to get more people on the playing field that haven't been there before, that need that friends or family rounds of investment, and they can go down to the Impact Hub and get, as we call, business scaffolding to help these entrepreneurs with marketing, with legal, with different things that they need to help ensure that their company succeeds. Excuse me. So this whole idea of free market versus selective capitalism. I love Adam Smith. You guys are going to joke me here a little probably. I read his book 3 times, believe it or not. Read it 3 times. And I was fascinated because you see that free market capitalism is always about not suppressing or not artificially putting something in place that would inhibit contribution. But what we see in American history is exactly opposite. Why was 40 acres and a mule a government handout, but going with 160 acres to go west, patriotic, right? It's the same thing, but yet it's packaged differently. So why is it that when one group of contributors gets a assistance, it's called welfare system, but it's called a stimulus package when another group of contributors gets that, right? It's the language, and we have to change that because it's not just hurting us, it's hurting everybody. It's not just hurting communities of color. The reality is it's everybody is affected and impacted by racism, and that's why we need to solve this problem together. This idea of selective capitalism, this whole idea of artificially created poverty. Going back to Adam Smith, right? You don't want to artificially create nothing. You want free market capitalism to go. But when you have black codes that say you can't vote, when you have economic policies that were created, and then all of a sudden one day we're supposed to forget about it, right? It's done. Racism is no longer an issue. There's no longer any historical, multi-generational implications of redlining or any of these factors, but the reality is it has been. And now the expectation is to take free market capitalism and solve, I'm fine for now, thank you, and solve for the problem that was artificially created. But guess what? It wasn't free market capitalism that got us to where we're at today. It was the visible hand of racism and oppression. That's what got us here today. And in order for us to get out of that, we have to be more intentional. Now, I'm not saying we should start going and messing around with the system too much, but the reality is we do need a different way of going forward. Because if we don't, we're going to still have the same cycle. If it wasn't free market capitalism itself that got us out of, that can get us out of there. I wish it was, though. So the friendship gap, this is huge. Now, most people talk about you're reading White Fragility and other books, they talk about these things that have happened to communities of color, right? But the biggest problem is that there's been a friendship gap that's been created. There was a study done by the Pew Research where 81%, 82% of respondents came back and said, I don't even have a friend of color. Now, before we start going to pointing the finger and say, well, it's probably because you're racist, let's think about it again. What happened historically, right? We came to the United States. We had indigenous folks we broke promises from them. We then brought slaves here and then said, oh, by the way, once we're done with you, how about you go back to Liberia, right? Then we fast forward, we started having redlining, different policies that prevented relationships from naturally forming. And now it's to the point where people can't think of a person of color that they can invest in. It's not because they're not there. We see that black women in particular are one of the most educated group of entrepreneurs and folks, contributors in America today. Yet the investment into contributors of color that are women is something on the lines of 0.0006%, statistically insignificant. They don't even measure investments into indigenous communities. Nobody even tracks that. But there's huge potential that's latent inside there. And the purpose of me telling you is not to make people feel guilty. The purpose of me telling you this is to think about how can I become a more intentional contributor by forming friendships with people that don't look like me. I'll give you a good example. In my faith community, one of the things they talk about is let's go do service projects. They're very important service projects, but let's change the language off of service projects. Let's talk about relationships. And so if you're going to go buy coffee, why not go to a black-owned coffee shop? If you're going to get your hair cut, why not go to a barber and get your hair cut? That's where the community's at. That's where relationship is formed. And then you'll start to realize that there's plenty of opportunities. It's just a relationship needs to be formed. And I'll add to this, many folks, whether or not they're in government or nonprofit or for-profit, want to solve the problem of racial inequality, but everybody's skipping the step of relationship and trying to go straight to problem solving. We can't do that. We have to humanize one another by getting to know one another. We have to understand what it is that communities of color actually want, not assume what they want. And the only way you can do that is slow down, so eventually you can go fast. Slow down to get the relationship, so eventually you can go faster to get investments of communities of color and to help launch and scale companies that are going to win and be successful. I'll add one more thing as far as the barriers to contribution that exist for communities of color. When many people see athletes and professionals, they say, wow, these folks have made it. But there's something called an anchoring heuristic, an availability heuristic, I'm sorry. And this availability heuristic is a rule of thumb that says, I can see Paul Campbell and he's successful. So racism must not be a problem. What it is an overweighting of one set of data at the exclusion of everything else. For every black and brown contributor that makes it out of artificial poverty, there's a ton of family members back at home, back in artificially created ghettos, right? And there's a remittance payments that has to be done. I remember one time my uncle came to my house from Minneapolis and he said, hey, you know, nephew, it takes gas money to get over here, right? Now that seems very crazy, right? But the reality is, here's a person who went through civil rights, who got hooked on drugs, who has not been able to get past that because of the artificially created poverty that he grew up around. And now he's talking about, do I have gas money to get back here? I have to pay him to get him back home because he's my blood, right? And so even though you may see successful athletes that make it big, they also have to pay payments back to their loved ones who haven't made it out of artificial poverty. So this whole idea of racial economics, and this is kind of the meat of this conversation, historical choice architecture. So choice architecture is very interesting. This is a setup to create an environment where a deterministic point of view will happen. So say, for example, we order a steak. There's a medium steak, there's a small steak, and a big steak. Most people will go to the medium steak, and the people may know that, so they'll actually increase the profitability on that medium steak, knowing that you're going to be anchored in this bigger steak, right? It's a simple example of that. Now, we think about historical choice architecture by putting black and brown contributors artificially into environments where there's liquor stores right next to elementary schools and all these different things that happen like that. There's an assumption that why people are there is because of their own personal choices. That if they could just pick themselves up by the bootstraps that we hear so much about, that somehow they'll be able to get out of it. But it's a framing that says the problem is not my problem, the problem is your problem, because if you only. And we see that that's not really the case. The second is this BIPOC anchoring heuristic. The anchoring heuristic is a point of reference that is like a burden of proof, essentially. So, for example, I have to prove to people when I step into an environment that I am not a low-life, degenerate thug who is hell-bent on making sure that I can, depress my local environment. And then I have to apply for a job, right? And then when I'm at this job, I have to constantly prove to my boss and to others that I can talk professional, which really means I can talk white. So what the data shows is that this burden, this cognitive burden placed on these contributors is something that most of us don't think about when we come to the work, because we're just coming to work. But that's a cognitive burden that black and brown contributors come to work every day. Are they saying the wrong thing? Are they going to offend the person because they're not culturally aware or they don't have friends of color? And so then that burden of proof is not on the other contributors, it's on us. And what science has shown is that there is the same symptoms that veterans come back from war with PTSD is what many contributors of color deal with every day. They have PTSD and they show up to work. Imagine, if for you will, that this whole room was all black and brown and you're the only white person in that room. How does that feel? Now, imagine, if you will, you're now forced to contribute and you still have that burden of being the only person in that room that's white. It causes an effect on your ability to perform, right? Many black and brown contributors also know that in order to get jobs that our white counterparts get, we have to be 3 times better than our peers. In fact, oftentimes, it's white contributors are able to learn on a job. Black and brown contributors have to already be there before they get the job. That's backwards, right? So there's all kinds of things that we need to think about. And I'm not here to put blame or shame on people. This is a problem that we're all facing. And I'm saying that we can solve the problem better if we all start with a simple act of, I want to get to know you, Paul. I want to get to know who you are, who your family is, what are the concerns that you have. Let's build a friendship, and hopefully we can solve this problem together. The last one is society availability heuristic. And this goes back to seeing the successful people that have been out there, and you can only call to mind to a certain group. Like you see, former President Obama and others, and say, hey, they're successful. That must mean everybody else is successful. So I want to talk about this idea of cultural residency. In a few weeks, I guess in the next week or so, you guys are going to read this book, White Fragility. I want to put a little disclaimer out there. White fragility might make you feel a little guilty, right? It's important to read, but it's also important in the context. But I'm saying this point because if you only do book knowledge, that's head knowledge. It doesn't go to your heart. You need to have experiential learning as a part of this. Try a new culture's food. Sit in an environment that you feel uncomfortable with. If you're a Republican, talk to a Democrat. If you're a Democrat, talk to a Republican. Go to places where you just are out of place, right? And then develop this culture of residency. We would never have a doctor go straight from med school to do open heart surgery. But yet, when it comes to this issue of racial inequality and justice, we have people going from reading books to trying to make things happen automatically, skipping, again, the relationship step. So if you do a cultural residency, you can get more out of cultural residency by being more intentional about where you spend your dollars and what kind of conversations you have than you can if you pay a consultant to come in and identify where your racial gaps are. Why? Because it's experiential. You know better, and it now becomes co-created. After you move beyond reading books and to that point, and now you're actually getting into the real work of getting things done, you realize that you're going to get better results because you know the people you're talking to. As an entrepreneur, you wouldn't just go out there and say, I think I know what my customers want. You have to talk to your customers to figure out what they want. Otherwise, you're going to be a nonprofit organization, right? Excuse me. So really, the call to action that I have for a lot of folks is, we have, in the Twin Cities, we have a tremendous opportunity here in front of us. We were known for George Floyd. We were known for having the worst graduation rates for students of color. We were known for having for being the fourth worst ranked place for people of color to live. Why? See, instead of jumping to inclusion and say, well, there must be just racism alone, we have to do the thick thinking to realize what is the actual cause of this, and how can we solve this? How am I doing time, by the way? I get passionate.
10 minutes.
Okay, wow, I talk fast. Yeah, there you go. And so here's an opportunity. We're talking to firms in Silicon Valley. We're talking to folks in Wall Street. Brown Venture Group, we really like to have this narrative from our community be changed, right? Invest into Brown Venture Group. Let us invest into communities of color. Let's co-create success. But don't just invest into us. Make our businesses a part of the supply chain. And that's hard to do because right now we have to manage risk and things like that. Guess what? Those risk assessments didn't factor in people of color. So what does that mean? We have to recreate onboarding diverse talent pipeline. We have to recreate what it means to onboard diverse suppliers, right? So yes, invest into Brown Venture Group, but also how can we move past economic stage 1 to economic stage 2, and that is the supply chain, right? So this is part of that. And the third thing is the relational aspect of things. Now, I'm not saying that you have to go way be outside of your comfort zone. People say all the time, you gotta get outside your comfort zone. Now, let's hold on a second here. What are you already good at, right? What is the thing that you can do that's really excellent? And then how can that thing be applied to communities of color? Don't go out and build homes if you don't know how to build homes. I know we love doing that for service projects and things like that, but I'm not a carpenter, right? If you are an investor, teach investment. If you are in sales, teach sales, right? Don't go beyond, you don't have to solve world hunger or solve racism all by yourself. That's never gonna happen. It's one relationship at a time. It's one conversation at a time. And it's taking what you're already good at and applying it to your culture around you. So that is the simplest way to figure out what next. Well, you start with what you're good at. And secondly, is this relationships. I say it over and over again, relationships. Stop doing things for communities of color, and let's shift our thinking to do things with communities of color. The cognitive biases that plague us all, nobody's excluded from it, is the thing we have to be really way more intentional. The reality is, the reason why I started studying the subject of behavioral science was because I wanted to know my own self. I was impulsive. I tend to buy things differently. My wife was like, why'd you do that? I'm like, I don't know. I wanted to know. Instead of pointing the finger at everyone else and saying, you need to fix yourself, I had to fix myself. I had to understand what I was dealing with so that I can become a better contributor. Because now that I know myself a lot better, I know how to respond to my fellow citizen. That makes sense? So maybe I'll have more time for questions here because I think this is an important topic. And I know people maybe have questions that they want answered. I'll try my best. Was that 5 minutes?
About 8 minutes.
3 minutes for a question. There you go.
I appreciate you coming and thank you very much for what you've said. I heard you use a phrase, artificial poverty, and I'm wondering if you can explain that concept of artificial poverty.
Certainly. So the question was, can I explain this for Zoom people, the concept of artificial poverty? What does I mean? What do I mean by artificial poverty? So when you study economics, the idea is that talent and capital will find the best, the best and brightest essentially from that space. Artificial poverty was policies that were created that, if not there would be better flourishing. For example, Black Code said you couldn't vote, you couldn't have certain jobs. And if you left the state where you're at, you had vagrancy laws, which means you'd be locked up. So that's a form of a system that created poverty from that standpoint of view. Second part of this is the cost of capital. It actually costs more money to be broke than it does to be rich, right? And the cost of goods and services in poverty-stricken areas have a higher cost of capital than they do outside of that. Again, that's artificially created because of the environment. When redlining occurred, they put these communities next to industrial places that had toxic fumes, coming. Now kids get greater asthma. You've seen the statistics around the Black and brown contributors being affected by COVID more. Why was that? Because of where the communities were at, right? And then when it came time to actually contributors who actually could afford to live in these communities during redlining and others, they were kicked out, not because they were not good citizens or pay their dues, but because simply other folks didn't want them in the community, even though they could afford to. So that artificially created, poverty from generation to generation. And when people think about hiring talent as an example, this is what I hear all the time. Dr. Campbell, I really want to hire the most qualified talent, but I just can't find them. They don't have what I need. Where did the problem start? It didn't start when they applied for the job. It started when they were trying to get their first job. And they couldn't get it because they maybe dressed a certain way, you know, and they didn't get on the playing field. We know that experience is super important to gain wealth. In fact, John D. Rockefeller, that's what he did when he was in Cleveland when he was younger. 16 years old, he would go around from place to place trying to find a job. Couldn't find it. He just went back to the top of his list. All he wanted was experience so that he can eventually become a contributor. So that's what I mean by artificial poverty, where there are policies and systems in place that if they weren't there, there would be greater economic and human flourishing from that perspective. Good question. Yes, sir.
In Minneapolis, you talked about the dropout rate or the education level. Are schools like Hope Academy, and there's some others, I want to say Agnes Day, but that's not right. There's some through the Roman Catholic.
Crystal Ray.
Thank you, Crystal Ray. Are they contributing? Are they helping this? Are you aware of them, and are they helping this? Is that a step in the right direction?
So the question was, are schools like Hope Academy and Agnes Grace, did I hear that right? Crystal Grace, are they helping? I know that I have friends who go attend that school. Here's the thing again. I'm gonna pick on the faith community a little bit. Bear with me a little bit. I started my professional career actually in ministry, full disclosure. My grandfather was a pastor, my dad was a pastor, my mom was in Africa right now as a missionary, right? Big hearts, big hearts. Sometimes they're not connecting to the mind in terms of solving a problem. So why do we go down to the inner city? We come back and we say, oh, I'm so blessed to live where I live. I feel so bad for those less fortunate people, right? So faith communities are not excluded from this conversation. In fact, I'm helping my church walk through this very thing. How do we change the language, the lenses? What are the more important thing is, what are the lenses cognitively that actually influence the way I see communities of color? That influence that, are they a project? Are they a ministry project? Or are they potential partners? Hope Academy does great work, don't get me wrong. But I challenge everybody to think about their thinking. It's called metacognition. And what comes to mind when you're trying to solve problems? I heard somebody say that poverty is an industry. And every industry has an economic incentive to keep itself around. So when you think about, sometimes when people they do good work with their heart, sometimes they're not connecting with their mind. My mom's, I love her to death, but sometimes she's one of them. We go back and forth. This is what I said to my mom. Okay, you're in Africa. You're trying to plant churches. Why not plant businesses that support churches? You create a job. That's one of the most spiritual things you can do, right? Then those people can support the church. Now, those of us who have a similar faith tradition I have, you look at the miracles that were talked about in the Bible, right? Every miracle is meet a practical need. People were sick and need to be healed. They were hungry and need to be fed. So we skip past the practical side of things to make ourselves feel good about this emotional, like I help these less fortunate children. But why are they less fortunate? My thing is not that we shouldn't do these things. It's let's not stop at just dealing with symptoms. Let's go to the root causes of these things and then co-create the solution together. Next question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Rotary is a huge organization of business professionals.
He's about to name me off.
Yeah. Rotary is a huge organization of business and community leaders around the world, and certainly in our state. And we have both the expertise and the capital to do certain things to assist in unleashing the production from the African American community. What is something our organization could do on a base level to start? Could be something relational or otherwise, in your opinion.
Well, I think even when it comes to organizations like you, that's great that they want to do that. Because there's a learning curve with relationship, I arguably say invest in the Brown Venture Group and then come alongside us and help launch these companies where we can co-create these solutions together. Because they're going to need coaching, they're going to need mentoring, but I can find mentors for days. It's an investment that sparks the capital, that gets them off the ground. That's super important. But I don't want you to stop and just give money, come down and build relationships, because long term, we're going to see a better Twin Cities when all of our contributors are reaching their full potential. Thank you so much. I didn't get yanked.
Oh, stay there.
Oh. That was my goal, by the way. Just don't get yanked. I can be long-winded.
Thank you very much for your presentation today. I really like the part where
you brought in relationships and friendships. If you don't know somebody, you can't predict what they need.
Thank you.
So that's it. So we in Rotary are 1.2 million people around the world doing good. We are involved in literacy, peace, water, and health, and even a little thing called polio. Since 1985, Rotary has been working in eradicating polio. In your honor today, we are going to make a donation to Every Meal, formerly the Sheraton Story. And what they do is they work to fill the meal gaps for students and young people around the metropolitan area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a good cause. I'm familiar with it. Thank you.
That was great. Okay, next week's speaker will be District Governor Tom Gum. And looking ahead, on February 12th is the Skate to End Polio. February 15th through April 26th, we're going to be having virtual fireside chats. So next week, Susan Johnson will be talking about that. February 16th is our leadership series, Jan Lehman talking about productivity. And on March 3rd is our vocational happy hour. I want to thank you for joining us live. Thank you for being on Zoom. Thank you so much, Dr. Campbell. That was excellent. I want to leave everybody with a quote. Talent is the multiplier. The more energy you invest in it, the greater the yield. Marcus Buckingham. With that, meeting adjourned.